Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Linda Kimiko August, curator of the Art and Artifacts Collection and Visual Materials Cataloger, and I will be hosting tonight's fireside chat featuring Dr. Michelle Lee, who will be presenting her talk, Apparatuses of Footbinding, Tracing a Genealogy of Violence Against Asian Women. For those who may be new to us, the Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library founded in 1731. We hold over 1 million books, graphics, and art and artifacts, which we make available through research, exhibitions, and programming, both on-site and online. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Lee, who is currently a Humanities and Leadership Learning Series postdoctoral fellow at Case Western Reserve University, where she also teaches in the history department. She received her PhD in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. Lee's research has been generously supported by the Social Sciences Research Council, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and the Huntington Library, Museum, and Botanical Gardens. You can find her work published in Women in Performance, a journal of feminist theory, Art Asia Pacific Magazine, and Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas. In fall 2024, she will be joining the University of Illinois, Chicago as an assistant professor of global Asian studies. I'm really genuinely excited to learn more about Michelle's fascinating research tonight, so please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Linda. Just to make sure everyone can see my PowerPoint, right? Loading, okay. First, I have to give thanks to Allison for coordinating all the details and making this event possible, for Linda for being a fantastic archivist and resource. You've been just a really great person to get to be in conversation with. As someone who's not trained in handling archival materials, you've really made the process incredibly eye-opening, definitely less intimidating with all of your references. Additionally, I've really appreciated having my time as a research fellow and being in conversation with different scholars. There's definitely a kind of generous collegiality at the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. In tonight's talk, I examine footbinding as a specific genealogy of violence against Asian women. And I'm going to begin with an introduction of an installation titled Terrarium by a New York-based artist named Catalina Ouyang. In Terrarium, 5 sculptures of golden lotuses, a moniker for bound feet, lay across a pile of sand that resembles a pool of blood. You can tell they're exhausted. For centuries, they've carried bodies upon their small frame. They help narrativize aspirations for colonial expansion and intervention. They've entertained thousands of viewers with their burlesque curves and silky covers. They've traveled across open seas and cramped spaces. They've been dissected in front of men, and now they face extinction. Bound feet have labored physically and symbolically, but here, Ouyang imagines their afterlife, but not without self-admonishment. When exhibited at the rubber factory in New York's Chinatown, known to be experiencing rapid gentrification, Ouyang writes of how they came to this image to think about their relationship with their great-grandmother, the last person in their family to practice footbinding. They write, quote, "Their likeness is sourced from various Google image searches. As I reach through digital proxy to try to know my great-grandmother, any one or none of the 5 stone feet could represent hers. These objects, as vestiges of familial memory as well as fraught national history, have in a way plundered by way of my own diasporic migration and attended internalized colonization to come to rest at the rubber factory." How does one lay to rest an icon of Asiatic femininity that has been trafficked for centuries? Conjuring their great-grandmother and the intergenerational impact of footbinding, Terrarium captures a particular entanglement of pain and love in the history of footbinding that informs their understanding of themselves. While it was a practice both capitalized and captured by colonizers, it was also deemed sacred and matrilineal. In refusing to disentangle these histories, Terrarium brings to bear the generations of viscera, embedded in the domestication of Chinese women at the hands of mothers and daughters, while also attempting to tend to what remains of these relationships in their own life. Thus, to lay to rest per terrarium is not to disappear footbinding, but to release them of their iconicity and to imagine them living alongside new meanings and different ways of being. Terrarium is a foray into the elusive nature of violence against Asian women, a term that often eludes and evades definition. It's this term that gets thrown around a lot and is meant to designate a range of acts and violations that might be considered hate crimes, but often fall short. Debates around how and what is considered violence against Asian women have shed light on the difficult nature of articulating gendered and racialized forms of violence. In 1991, for example, a group of Asian women gathered to study the nexus of violence against Asian women and hate crimes, and concluded that legal definitions were limiting. For an act of violence to be considered a crime, there must be evidence of social bias, whether that's based on race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, class, and so on. But what they found was that these designations often left Asian women who experienced violence by the hands of family members, of those within or who are categorized in the same racial and ethnic background, or those who are in queer intimate partnerships could not seek help. Instead, the group suggested a more expansive view of hate violence that was rooted in evaluating the relationship between the attacker and the victim. Others, however, have called for more nuance. Erin Quay-Nin, for example, in her essay, Without Enhancements, Sexual Violence in Everyday Lives of Asian American Women, challenges us to reconsider how violence might be internalized as part of Asian women's subject formation, theorizing how white supremacist heteropatriarchal culture in the US and across various cultures raise Asian women to be model minority subjects whose social role is to endure violence. Thus, unlike liberal calls or recognition of violence that demands institutionalization to name violence against Asian women, Ouyang tracks instances of harm and violence in the quotidian, to the realm of the domestic and sometimes how it plays out in secrets. Situating various visual cultures of footbinding within these conversations, my talk this evening examines apparatuses of footbinding to locate moments wherein Asian America and Asian American femininity coheres and also doesn't around different kinds of representations of violence. I organized this talk primarily in two sections. The first is dedicated to analyzing archives from the 19th century to understand the genealogy of footbinding and how it organized Asian women's experiences or just Asian women in relationship to violence. Marked by the arrival of Fang Moi, the first documented Chinese woman to immigrate to the US, I consider the 19th century as an originary moment within which the West begins to formulate formal epistemologies of the Asiatic through the documents that you see here. I refer to these various forms of documentation as apparatuses and suggest that they do not merely function to describe and teach about the cultural practices, right, of China, to think about where this is a time period where you saw a lot of objects coming into the US, the displays of Chinese museums were meant to be educational, but they also functioned as apparatuses of imperialism, such that they congealed Chinese women as always already subjugated and therefore are figures that are always predicated on their susceptibility to violence and harm. If this is the condition upon which Asian women appear in the West, as always already a violated, subjugated figure, then this means that we need articulations of violence against women that shift away from legibility and recognition and towards something else. To this end, the second part of this talk turns to the artwork of Catalina Ouyang to think through such possibilities where violence lives alongside kinships and within intimacies. Taking inspiration from terrarium's grounded methodologies that consider the politics of necessity for women to survive their social conditions, I ask, how can rooting violence in familial history, diasporic experiences, and intimacy shift the frameworks through which Asian women and Asiatic femininity are made visible? And what shifts in understanding of the social conditions of Asian women occur when we acknowledge forms of violence as not a problem to be solved by liberal democracy, but a force that shapes a way of being and makes life as much as it takes away from it. In doing so, I don't intend to present a traditional history of footbinding. I really rely on the brilliant works of historians like Patricia Ebrey, Dorothy Cohen, Peng Wang to kind of formulate a foundational history. But in this talk, I offer a genealogy of footbinding to understand how the West constructs a relationship between violence and Asian women. In general, footbinding was continuously resignified to evince Oriental despotism, inferiority, and Asiatic objecthood, whether it was referred to as a cultural practice, an image, an object, or body part. And across all these documents, it's clear that footbinding was important to constructing Asian women as victims of their social conditions. It is through various apparatuses that the US and British merchants, photographers, missionaries, collectors, and physicians became experts on the matter and established a kind of common sense where the only figuration of Chinese women you would see would always be in relationship to the superiority of European civilization, making it such that the only depictions of Chinese women popularized in this time period would be in how they were oppressed and subjugated. For those who are not so familiar with footbinding, it's considered a beauty practice where Chinese mothers or female elders were responsible for compressing young girls' feet to keep them from growing past a certain size. Most testimonials describe that it required curling toes underneath the sole, wrapping them with cloth bandages, and eventually breaking bones in a way such that the feet wouldn't protrude outward, but sort of grow under. It was widely practiced by many Chinese women and girls across the country, spanned across class and caste, and was matrilineal, but there was by no means a standardized way of binding feet. And even though it was officially banned by the Chinese government in 1912, it's still practiced. Reports in the 19th century often hyper-emphasize the process of footbinding as painful, saddening, and oppressive. But it was also sometimes considered an aside in some of the writings, distinct, right, from describing, per se, the actual social status of Chinese women. This was the case in Henrietta Schucks's book, Scenes in China, where she creates two chapters where one is titled The Little Feet of the Chinese, and the other is Female Degradation. In one scene, she writes, "It excited sympathy to see a small-footed female hobbling along the streets with an umbrella in her hand for support, or leaning upon the shoulder of a servant, or with one hand busily employed against the walls of the houses by which she may pass to secure a proper balance." In the latter chapter, Shuck writes of her observations of the ways Chinese women are invisibilized, treated poorly by men, and are uneducated, right? They weren't allowed to learn to read, for example. Their social role was to serve Chinese men. There's a moment where she does include the injuries that Chinese women might accumulate given their feet. But overall, this chapter sought to drive home the importance of spreading Christianity to help Chinese women. She writes in the end of the chapter of Female Degradation that this sentence, which I thought was really profound, right? "The sad condition of our sex in China can never be alleviated until Christianity triumphs in this cruel land. In connection with anything else than Christianity, there is no hope. For it is that alone that assigns to woman her proper rank in society and secures her against the encroachments of the stronger sex." As a figuration of Asiatic femininity represented amongst objects, footbinding also incited feelings of excitement, thrill, adoration, and eroticism. In print media, the notorious Ah Feng Moi, known as the Chinese lady and the first officially documented Chinese woman to travel across the Americas, is presented as a spectacular figure. This particular advertisement from 1835 depicts a caricature of Ah Feng Moi leaning on an imported table. For only 50 cents, the ad states that visitors could go to the Chinese Museum at Washington Hall and see Afong as part of the Chinese saloon on display. So here you see this ad describing, in the paragraph, describing how old she is, the fact that she started wearing iron shoes at a really young age, her feet don't protrude beyond 3 inches, and also that she's accompanied by a translator named Ah Kong, who is described to share a similar pleasing form. Moi's value and allure rests on her ability to sell chinoiserie, but she herself is also a spectacular object, described as an Asiatic person that overcame great obstacles, including traversing a great distance and disobeyed Chinese sentiments. Not only embodying an important racialized other for Anglo-Americans, Moi's most distinctive appeal is her feet, and it's also what marks her as different from Ah Kong, her translator. It's Ah Fong who gets recognized over and over again as the first Chinese woman to travel to the Americas, right? Despite the fact that there is this presence of another Chinese woman. Here, right, I think about how the writing of Rosemary Garland Thompson, and how her framework, right, about visibility and disability is what often marks figures as, quote, identifiably human, but resolutely different, and, quote, operates as the vividly embodied stigmatized other whose social role is to symbolically free the privileged, idealized figure of the American self from the vagaries and the vulnerabilities of embodiment, end quote. Afang Moi and her feet, in other words, embodies the threat of vulnerability and penetrability against the superiority of whiteness. Elsewhere, foot binding as a medical anomaly attempts to describe the anatomical structure of this body part through objectivity. In 1829, the Royal Society of London received an amputated foot of a Chinese woman who was found drowned in a river in Canton. Dissected by Bransby Blake Cooper, who was a surgeon, he claims that the purpose of the report was not to make any observation or inferences of Chinese society, but to isolate all aspects of the foot as a medical specimen. What's interesting is that the report mobilizes difference to support hypotheses of scientific racism, emphasizing social inferiority with the anatomical structure, while also doing very little to offer a pathology. He describes the aspects of the foot with great detail, making note of all the different ligaments, the bone structures, the size, the height, the length of different toes, thinking about the different kinds of insteps. And then sprinkled between these metrics is also the discourse of Orientalism and disability to mark its corporeal otherness. For example, there's a quote in there that says that the audience of the Royal Society should esteem it hideous deformity of the Chinese human foot had its origin in Oriental jealousy, or was the result of an unnatural taste in beauty. He admits towards the end of the report that he's not certain what kind of health impacts the foot binding had on a woman, but in offering this report, he thought, quote, it would be considered curious and calculated to the interest of scientific myth, end quote. And then there's the work of stereoscopes, museum catalogs, and museum collections, which were as much instructional as they were imperialist. Books like James Rickleton's 1901 China Through the Stereoscope and William Langdon's museum catalog of Nathan Dunn's Chinese Museum accompanied collections of stereographs and objects from China, objects of and from China respectively. They functioned as guides to help viewers make sense of the photographic images and objects, but their circulation was also a form of publicity as much as they were themselves cultural objects. And while these texts served to curate different forms of media, they sought to train the gaze to interpret Oriental ideologies from the images and the objects by staking claims of universality. So for example, in the introduction of James Rickleton's Through the Stereoscope in this chapter that he writes, How to Use, right, he instructs readers and viewers to believe that they were traveling across China, stating things like, the stereograph tells no lies, it is binocular, it gives the impression that each eye would receive on the ground, affording essentially, and this is a quote, perfect vision and giving the most realistic ocular perception attainable in photographic art. And in another moment, he also writes, furthermore, sight is our cleverest sense of the acquisition of knowledge. To see is to know. In the museum catalog, similar didactics instruct viewers visiting the museum to take their observations as facts, right? Observations that are the thick descriptions that are offered in the museum catalog. And even when viewers would be looking at different cases, right, with figurines displayed in these cases that were miniatures or dolls, the text in the museum catalogs would suggest that if the viewer could just, cast their imagination, right, it would be as if they were seeing real Chinese people, even though, again, they were looking at objects, figurines, mannequins that were encased. And just a quick moment, I wanted to point to some of the images I have here. So on the upper left is one of the stereographs that's listed in James Rickleton's book, China Through the Stereoscope. And something that's kind of interesting that I don't get too much into is when we get to the section in the book, Rickleton describes how he's searching for, right, this perfect specimen to photograph as part of the stereographs that he wants to print. And part of that story is that he was having a very difficult time finding a person who would be willing, right, to take off their silk covers, the embroidered silk shoes, to show him, and eventually was able to find a young woman by bribing them with some currency, and even acknowledges in the text that there was a kind of humiliation that was happening, which he attributes, right, to the idea that there was something that the young girl knew was maybe not was unsettling, right, about footbinding. But for me, reading it, it really was a testament to kind of the violence of exposure, really, right? The kind of the colonial gaze and the desire to expose. These are images that came from the Centennial International Exposition of 1876. I couldn't actually find any objects that would have been in Nathan Dunn's collection. It had displayed for a couple of years in Philly, eventually moved to London, and then when Nathan Dunn had fallen under harder times, he had to sell and auction off a lot of his objects. But I wanted to put some things out there to kind of show, I think, what I might imagine would be some of the mannequins and figurines that were part of the museum, and to think about how curious, right, it is to ask viewers to imagine and to project as if they were seeing real human figures. And how audiences were being trained to see objects as people. So it really goes into this other history of how of the racial logics, right, of objecthood and passivity and smallness when it comes to the Asian American community. Given the ways that Chinese women were made relevant to the US American publics according to their low status, passivity, vulnerability, self-sacrifice, and objecthood, all of which are racial, gendered, and disability logics of footbinding, I made the claim that Western epistemes of violence is an ontological condition of Asiatic femininity. That is, in addition to smallness, ornamentality, and licentiousness as markers of Asian women's racial and gender difference, logics of violence is what often makes Asian women a persona grata in the first place, right? Thus, to reprimand violence against Asian women requires articulating exceptional forms of harm that exceed the common sense threshold. So, for example, we see how this plays out even today in contemporary in current conversations, right, around stop anti-Asian hate campaigns. To name one such example of the spectacularization of targeted violence, I think about the discourse that emerged in the aftermath of the anti-Asian rhetoric attributed to the COVID-19 outbreak and the Atlanta spa shootings of March 16, 2021. And here's just a screen grab of some of the different reports that were coming out at the time. There are graphs that show or are attempting to show empirical evidence of gender discrimination. You have an FAQ section trying to define, what is a hate act, and then other forms of reporting to identify the, exact locations, right, and the kinds of acts, right, that folks experience, also noting, right, that a disproportionate number of the reported hate crimes seem to be reported by folks who either identify as women or non-binary. At the same time, feminist writers and scholars have importantly reminded us that this kind of targeted violence is not new, chasing a history of violence that was embedded in US imperial and colonial projects. So to be clear, I'm not critiquing the work of reporting or the raising of consciousness, right? These kinds of documentations have bearing on policies. It's just that the logics upon which these violences are made visible and the kind of embedded urgency demanded by the state to intervene reinforces liberal modes of governing, and such fervor neglects to acknowledge the interconnections between the ongoing struggles of minoritized subjects. And I think it also serves as a reminder that even though violence against Asian women is connected to the longstanding histories of imperialism and colonialism, how and with what frameworks we use to examine, articulate, and confront gendered forms of violence within the Asian American community remains a difficult task. This next portion of my talk shifts back to terrarium, and here I offer a few drafty thoughts on how I see Ouyang integrating, personal history, kinship, intimacy, and lived experience to disrupt Western frameworks of footbinding. In Loving a Disappearing Image, Laura Marks redefines melancholy in order to examine the gaze that is cultivated between a viewer and a degrading piece of media. She asks if one could rethink melancholia not as a threat to the ego, nor a desire for self-annihilation, but as an ongoing act of love. Put otherwise, she proposes that the sense of mourning and affection mirrored by the material decomposition of the film is a devotional melancholy where the sense of self is dispersed rather than unified. There are two propositions that I see relevant to Ouyang's work from Marx's definition of loving melancholy and devotional melancholy to Ouyang's work. One is that when confronted with images of loved ones that are physically deteriorating, a viewer may experience a sense of loss that is attached to their own identification and subjectivity, from which senses of melancholia and mourning of loss emerge, and with, quote, the loss of unified selfhood. And two, that the recognition of this composite selfhood brought to bear through grief, mourning, melancholia, the kind of foreclosure of wholeness is not synonymous with self-destruction. Defining melancholy and mourning in this way, I map Marx's devotional melancholy onto terrarium to examine the implication of subjectivity in Ouyang's work. That to produce a sense of loving melancholia towards women with bound feet and their disappearance is to maintain an identification with Chinese femininity attached with sensations of loss and lack of wholeness. In terrarium, Ouyang brings together 19th century discourse of footbinding with stories that come from their own family. They learned that at a young age, their great-grandmother had fallen carrying the artist's mother. They write, "After that, she was relieved of her duty, and my grandfather left the house hours early every day to push my mother on his bicycle to daycare, where she was raised away from her family. This left generational implications in how my family to this day navigates nurture and intimacy. My mother, who never wanted children, who hates babies to this day, all her thick blood and tough love. Me asking my grandmother recently, did you like babies? Did you want to have kids? She barked with laughter. Nobody cared if you liked this or that. You just did. Carved from various stone materials, Ouyang intentionally references and embodies the Western canonical form of marble sculpture, but the use of decorative stones like alabaster, wonderstone, and soapstone give these limbs a kind of ornamentation and beauty that reinscribes Asiatic femininity to the objects. To render bound feet in such a way makes visible the intergenerational trauma that traverses along matrilineal lines. We as viewers are brought into the intimate exchanges between mothers and daughters. Ouyang's question is earnest, right? They want to know where desire, self-determination, and agency lied in the so-called sacred practice, in a practice that framed tough love as a shared language between mothers and daughters, but to no avail, right? Their grandmother replies that there was no sense of choice. Terrarium draws a connection between the viewer and lotus and the lotus feet, where viewers mourn the lack of personhood while also expressing a devotion to the lost subject and the dying culture and the ways in which it has ramifications on kinship. For example, the use of digital photographs and oral history are part of the method to crafting the golden lotuses into sculptures, which can be seen as a kind of devotion and commitment by the artist to invoke the grandmother, their great-grandmother, but without having to recreate the harm or the violence of exposure, right, that I kind of mentioned earlier from Rickleton and the stereograph. Furthermore, we might also think of the artist's choice to carve the image of golden lotuses as a quasi-performance of foot binding. But rather than using bandages, the art chooses the chisel. Rather than breaking bones and doing harm onto a body, to uphold a matrilineal sacred practice, they break the stone. In this transmutation from photographic image to sculpture, Ouyang also refigures foot binding as an expression of love between mother and daughters, akin to Audre Lorde's call for women to embrace the erotic as a divine and feminine power, but not without hesitation. And the artist's commitment to care and shepherd the objects, again, right, as they say, vestiges of memory and national history, is deeply rooted in their desire to explore the matrilineality of the practice. They write, to bind one's feet was, in effect, to perform one's cultural heritage. It was also a sacred practice shared between mothers and daughters, passed down with thick blood and tough love. Adrienne Rich writes, mothers and daughters have always exchanged with each other, beyond the verbally transmitted lore of female survival, a knowledge that is subliminal, subversive, preverbal. Fundamental to Ouyang's rumination over kinships is the question of how violence can become so ingrained in relational ties, foundational to intimacy, and even be conceived of as love. For those of us who have to bear the legacy of foot binding, thus have to come to a painful realization that the realization that those of us we perceive to be our closest loved ones are also the ones that pass down and inflict harm. That for all that foot binding was, it was also a practice that was dependent upon the intimacy of mother-daughter relationships. So in all the ways that it was so patriarchal, right, and oppressive and painful. Additionally, Ouyang's great-grandmother's response to their question of want and desire reveals the ontological conditions that shape their great-grandmother. Let me start again. Additionally, Ouyang's great-grandmother's response to their question of want and desire reveals the ontological conditions that shape their great-grandmother's understanding of who she was, a figure who could only survive by bearing pain, domestic duties, and tough love. In the face of that, or out of spite, terrarium is relentless in its efforts to find rest, while also acknowledging that to be an Asian woman is to survive through objectification and as inhuman. And to be visible is to negotiate when, where, and how their experiences of violence appear. Through Ouyang's practice, we arrive at the uneasy politics of surviving as inhuman. By attending to Love and Loss, Ouyang asks us to consider an ontology of Asian femininity through the remnants of deformity, traces of loving melancholy, and a survival of inhumanism. If footbinding was considered sacred and matrilineal, a practice that bound mothers and daughters through the exchange of blood, breaking of bones, and tears, then we have to question the structures of kinship and matrilineality in ways that acknowledge their proximity to patriarchal violence. Terrarium pushes us to consider what ways we are all complicit in perpetuating and participating in harm, and further, what is at risk, not when we don't speak of it, but when we do. Oh, sorry, too soon. In terms of shifting our understandings of violence against Asian women, we are in need of grammars that allow for us to acknowledge the ways violence intimately shapes the visibility of Asian American women, their relationship and understandings of themselves. It also allows for us to acknowledge how difficult it is to name them because of the risk it poses. If we know that mothers cared for their daughters by subjecting them to pain, how do we disentangle love from violence? And though matrilineality is sacred, can we and should we trust it? Hailing Vivian Wong's call to, quote, theorize, name, and hail wider practices of sexual intimacy and gender embodiment that are in conversation with trans feminist and queer-loving politics, one that does not normalize violence on the body, but acknowledge and articulate its gendered racialized forms, end quote. Ouyang refuses to normalize the violence they experience, including the ones that they have experienced by perpetrators, the ones that they may inflict onto their own bodies, and the ones that they inherit. And in that same spirit of queer-loving politics, they turn to tend to their relations rather than turn away from them. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much for that powerful and timely talk of your work. It's really got me thinking about so many things. If people have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A below. But in the meantime, while people are doing that, I have some questions. One of the things that I was thinking about is sort of in Western archives, so much of what is collected and what exists are these images of, foot binding, of harm, of women being seen as objects or actually objects themselves. So I'm wondering, how do you get at the sort of lack of first person accounts of these Asian women? You don't hear the Asian women's voices. And is that why you do this interdisciplinary work with contemporary artists?
That's a really great question. I think part of it is that I'm deploying kind of like a frictional reading against the archives to with a particular kind of framework of, how are these racial logics, how are these gendered logics? I turn to the contemporary because I think actually the contemporary artwork like Catalina Ouyang is really doing the transhistorical work, right? It's like I follow their lead more than anything else in how they engage. I mean, there is so much in their writing that they offer that not all artists tend to do, which is to explain the history a little bit, right? To kind of do that critical analysis of saying that footbinding was incredibly ambivalent. But here's where here's how it's impacting me, right? Here's how we might be able to ground ourselves in those networks that are ever shifting, right? Because racial logics, gender logics, they're constantly moving, right? Depending on what the state, what the colonizer needs. So that's my first response to your question. I was gonna say something else, but if it comes to me, I'll try to bring it up again. Thank you so much for that question.
Sure. So we have a comment. Dr. Lee, thank you for this talk. I very much appreciate your articulation of foot binding within the mother-daughter dynamic as a Lordian erotic. thought it was interesting. I wonder if you had thoughts about sort of mental and emotional trauma as disfigurement. I thought that Catalina Oyang's artist statements were so interesting, talking about the generational trauma.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to the comment about thinking about Lord's uses of the erotic and how there's so much emotion, right, behind the practice. I can only imagine. I think in terms of the mental and emotional trauma and disorder, could you say a little bit more about maybe what you were thinking?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, like, so often people are looking at the physical pain of the foot binding or the physical foot. But with
Mm.
Oyang's statement, it's sort of more than just the physical foot or just a physical disability. It's also talking about the emotions that get passed on or that the woman herself lived, that maybe we don't have documentation of her voice, or sort of the mental trauma of what colonialism, imperialism does to a person, and how that ripples through generations, not just the person who it was inflicted on.
Yeah, I think that that's a really apt observation. I think it's really clear to me that the artist's investment is to try to render visible some of the things that go so invisibilized, but in ways that don't spectacularize, right? That are very much, again, rooted in their relationships and intimacies. I think some of the things that I'm trying to work through about the term, right, violence against Asian women, this kind of political effort to locate, to name, to render in some way meaning out of this term that I think, again, like I have said this, right, evades and elides, right? And it's because it operates a lot, at least in popular discourse, against these very formal, right, manifestations of a hate crime, right? It's a perpetrator and then a victim. It's these kinds of acts, right? But towards what you're saying too, right, that it causes a ripple, right? That that kind of that there are other ways in which violence against Asian women also operates and traverses. It's in sometimes it's self-inflicted, right? But and it's not that I want to say that I don't want to condone that, right? But there is a history behind that. There is kind of a connection to be made, right, about how they're more symptomatic, right? They're symptomatic of something.
I'm wondering, one of the things that struck me was the ways capitalism plays into this too. The idea of, like, people selling images, trying to sell objects, trying to objectify people. The man, the photographer who was trying to find a woman he could pay to bare her feet so he could take pictures of it, so he could sell, those images. Do you have any thoughts, or what's your analysis on the role that capitalism and kind of the market plays into this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that some of the things that you're saying, okay, so how does capitalism, I mean, it's it goes hand in hand with the spectacularization that you see, that I see in the ways that Asian women are being described. That and so much of it really was about training a gaze to desire that. I'm not really sure how I've thought a little bit about it. I've been thinking so much about how how much these catalogs, the prints, they're training American publics really to see and to make like meaning, right, out of all of these characteristics that are othering, right? So they have to, in order to kind of have, to form or cultivate a sense of desire, right? They have to do it through the idea of wanting to consume the other. So those are some of the ways in which I'm seeing, the capitalism happening behind how Asian American women are being figured in these cultural works.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, you saying that they're training the public. It's kind of fascinating the way that, they're saying like the photograph is a document, is a fact. The museum, is displaying this, authority and facts, but it's subjective, right? It's like who is curating it, who is choosing what they're photographing, what's being exhibited, what's being collected, what's being put out there. Um, there's a lot of choice in that. It's not just this empirical fact that just exists out there.
Yeah, there is a lot of choice. And when I was revisiting some of these archival images and the text, I remember the first time I was reading the catalog, I wasn't quite sure what they meant by mannequins. Were they life size? I think some of them might have been, but it's really hard to say because there are no images, right, that I can find. But some of them were legitimately dolls. And then that would contrast, like with Nathan Dunn, he also had real people from China there too to help create a sense, like an immersive experience. But it's a certain kind of hustle to say, like, let's think of these dolls as real people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so we have a question here. Thank you so much for this talk. I learned so much. You spoke a little about Ouyang's ability to think through the ambivalence of foot binding through matrilineal practices, proximity to patriarchal power. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about Ouyang's work in shaping the viewer's effective response to their art. If it's likely not to provoke 19th century forms of sensational fetishization or sympathy, what other types of effect does it work to evoke? Potentially more minor feelings, thinking of Kathy Part Hong, Sian Nagai.
Mhm. Right, CNI. Yeah. I'm trying to think. So the question is about what are the other kinds of um affective qualities are evoked in Ouyang's work, and how did they kind of do that? A lot of their repertoire uses the body, actually. It's very visceral, and very familiar and defamiliarized at the same time. Sometimes I kind of consider that there's a bit of abjection, right? Like abjection with an A, right? The kind of you have what is the wholeness of a body, right? But then that'll get twisted and sometimes disfigured in Ouyang's work. And they want that. But there's something also about the commitment to the craft, the materiality of the objects that also elicits a very disciplined, really practice. I don't know how else to describe it, right? Like to make what seems like a small relic, right? These kind of soapstones, very hard material, incredibly decorative, and to do that as a translation of the digital images that they're referring to, I think requires a very intense kind of commitment to the material, right, and to grapple with it. And also there's a sense of like scale to their work as well. The kind of working of different sizes, right? And also there's an obsession. I feel like the only way I think about it is really by paying attention to the process. Like when you go and you go see Ouyang's work, for me, incredibly overwhelmed by by the sense of discipline in the process. I think part of it is also just to think about the references of like the minor feelings, right? To really make visible the frustrations of a minor life visible. Yeah, I would say that those are kind of the things that I see in their work. Right. Also a refusal to be an ornament, right? To kind of be of a form of Asiatic femininity that subscribes to I mean, I think about Anne Chang and ornamentalism, right? This kind of gleaming figure. I would say that Ouyang is not doing that, right? Trying to trace a really different kind of ontology of Asiatic femininity. Yeah, that's really similar, right, to embracing ugly feelings. Mhm. Thank you for the question.
Did you come across Ouyang's work first, and did that inspire you to do historical research, or were you doing historical research and then how did you come across Ouyang's work, and how does your historical research that you've done inform how you view her work, or has it changed how you think about when you see their work?
Mhm. I think so. I'm trying to remember what came first. It's almost like a chicken and the egg. Maybe because I've been sitting on this project for so long that I forgot. Um, I genuinely cannot remember the first time I came across her work. I have written a bit about other artists like Candice Lynn, right? And this particular installation that they did where they carved their future sarcophagus and had planned to, it was basically going to be a compost bin where they would eventually put their own body in, and they were training beetles to eat their own bodies. And that was kind of an art piece that I just thought was so provocative, but I really cannot remember what led me to Ouyang's work. But I would say that part of it might come from my own training in art history to be very invested and very, oh, how do I say this? Like, I'm very seduced by artwork. I think that artwork helps me understand history um, and sociality really better than most forms. So I think it might be a methodological preference. I would say if I were really to say, it must have been the artwork first. And then it helps me think about foot binding, but also how wanting to think about in all of my works, I draw a lot from the personal, actually, and in other places. And part of the work, what led me to my work in this case, was thinking about, my own experiences of violence and being inspired by other writers who are doing very similar work, of centering their own lived experiences, right, in order to theorize these larger issues. Right, and foot binding also happens to be a part of my history too.
I'm just curious, where do we go from here? Are there like certain areas where you think more research needs to be done, or more that you want to delve into?
Yes, I am really, really curious about how about the anatomical description of the bound foot that was performed in 1829. I was only aware of it after I had read a few chapters from Scenes in China, where Henrietta Schuck writes towards the end of The Little Few of the Chinese that this also, I heard about this dissection, so it must be really important, right? I would love to know a little bit more about how that report traveled, right? Who like other people who might have referenced it, and how significant it was, and kind of connect that, right? The kind of leisure and exposition of the body to, you know, like to what we have today in Bodies the Exhibit, for example, in body.
Got another question here. Thank you, Michelle. Regarding the stereograph where you can't see the woman's face, but you can see she's holding a fan on her lap when described by Langdon, was there any indication if the woman had any agency and what personal props were used in the image? Thank you.
So I was able, the one where you cannot see her face. So I was able to find what I think are other stereographs that does show the young woman's face. And I had realized that after looking at a Chinese American artist named Heng Liu, right, who's active in the 90s, who's doing painterly, right, portraits of women with bound feet, and then she is featured in there. I don't really know too much about what if they had any agency in the props. There is a fan, and I think at times you'll see in the different versions of the stereograph some of the background and the wallpaper kind of changing, or whatever sort of props are in the background. But I think that I would probably guess not. When I was reading through different accounts in like the China through the stereoscope, there were moments where you will the photographer will admit to saying, you know, I'll give let me say the exact example. There was he wanted to photograph a group of children and a Christian missionary woman, and he wanted her to pose in a certain way, but he also describes that he let her choose what child to bring and to stand with her. So that was a very clear indication of allowing those who are being photographed to have agency. But I really don't think that that was the case with the woman with the young photograph of the exposed feet. Oh, but then I'm wondering if we were thinking about a different photographic image, the one where you can see their face. I'm sorry. Could you can we go back to the question?
Yeah, sure. The stereograph where you cannot see the woman's face, but you can see she's holding a fan on her lap when described by Langdon. Was there any indication that she had any agency and what props were used?
Yeah, I don't think so. I would say that the agency was more in the moment where she was able to, right, decide that she would take her shoes off for money. But if we're thinking about props and understanding how much the photographer was really interested in staging kind of something authentic and ethnographic, I would say not. But I don't know for sure.
Okay, so we're getting close to time. So there's one last comment in the chat. It says, not really a question, more of a comment. I was reading Ouyang's artist statement for Terrarium, and she says, I do not know what my great-grandmother's feet look like. Their likeness is sourced from various Google image searches as I reach through digital proxy to try to know my great-grandmother. This reminds me of Linda's comment about the limitations of the women's firsthand accounts of this practice. And Michelle, what you were saying about the limits and violences of the archives and what scholars and artists must do to fill in the gaps. Very interesting and fascinating work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comment. If I could just give like a little plug in terms of someone's work, Judy Young, who is a historian, has a book, I think it's called Unbound Feet, where she was interviewing some of the older Chinese immigrants who still had bound feet. So if you're looking for kind of first person testimonials, I think her work is a really great place to start.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I really enjoyed your talk and our discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us and for your great questions and comments. Can't wait to hear more of your research.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful.